Story 1. I saw the Fouke Monster feeding. On the list of places that you've never been to, or will never go, Fouke, Arkansas is probably somewhere at the top. It's a tiny town in the southwesternmost part of the state. It's only really known for one thing, the Fouke Monster, the subject of an early 1970s film called The Legend of Boggy Creek. The monster supposedly doesn't exist, but I'm here to tell you that it does. I know this because I've seen it with my own eyes. In the early fall of 2016, I was making my way up north from Shreveport, Louisiana to Texarkana. I worked for one of the world's largest delivery companies, so at times I found myself driving late night or early morning hours. On this particular occasion, I was driving a large delivery van just after 2 a.m. in the morning. I was on the interstate, about 5 miles south of Fouke, and there was nobody else in sight. As I rounded a corner, something caught in my headlights in the distance. Just off to the side of the road, a deer was laying there, presumably hit by a vehicle at some point and left for dead. Nothing unusual about that. People see dead deer on the side of the road all the time. But what was unusual is that there was something with it, something large. At first I thought it was a bear. I began to slow my vehicle to get a better look. As I inched closer, I could see that this was no bear. It was something very large. It was kneeling, and it was feeding. A sudden feeling of dread and fear washed over me as I crept closer. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. If it wasn't a bear, the only other thing that it could have been was a man in a ghillie suit. But it couldn't have been that either. It was just way too large. It had hair all over, unnaturally elongated arms and hands, and it was using those arms and hands to carve out the insides of this deer. It was just scooping and eating as quickly as it could. It was primal and terrifying. It had blood all over its hands, mouth, and chest. It was the most horrific and grotesque sight I had ever seen. There was one other thing, too. It was staring directly at me. I was confused, curious, mortified, and terrified all at once. As I inched closer, it never wavered. Its eyes were locked onto me, and it just kept feeding. It's as if it were telling me, if you stop, this will be the last thing you ever see. As I got within about 30 feet or so, I snapped to my senses and smashed the gas pedal. I sped down the road, my heart nearly pounding out of my chest. As I reached Fouke, I felt like I was far enough down the road to be clear of it, so I pulled into a gas station to gather myself. When I stepped into the store, I was still shaken. There was a man behind the register. "You doing all right?" he asked with a curious look. I was sure that he noticed that there was something going on with me. "Yeah, I'm okay," I said. "Just need to grab a cup of coffee to keep myself awake." This was an obvious lie. My senses were on full alert and I couldn't have been any more awake. "I hear ya," the man said. I grabbed a cup of coffee and took it to the register. Pulled between wanting answers and risking sounding crazy, I finally looked at the man and said, "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but I saw something on the side of the road." "Okay," the man said. I continued. "It was big, and I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, it didn't look like a bear." The man looked at me and slightly nodded his head up and down as if to say, "Oh, you've seen it." "Do you know what it was?" I asked. The man took a breath and kind of stared off into the distance for a moment, like he was contemplating what to say to me. "Let me just say," he paused for another moment, "things around these parts that are supposed to be legends really aren't, and I'll leave it at that." I looked at him, half confused and half understanding. "If you see anything like that again, next time it's best to just keep driving and pretend that you didn't." I nodded, still in somewhat of a daze. I thanked the man, grabbed my coffee, and left. For about another year, I continued to drive that route, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Most nights were uneventful, as they should have been. Every now and then, however, I would spot a deer on the side of the road, and my heart would start pounding. The events of that night left an obvious mark on me, and they continue to do so even to this day. The legend of Boggy Creek, it seems, isn't really a legend after all. Story 2. I was stalked by the Beast of Bray Road. I grew up in northern Chicago, still live here and have many friends here. About 5 years ago, the best of my childhood friends moved to Madison, Wisconsin for a new job. A few weeks after he left, we had a discussion about me coming to visit him at his new place. Madison is northwest of where I live in Chicago, and a typical trip would take a little over 2 hours traveling west to Rockford, and then on north to Madison. "You know," my friend said, "instead of taking the quickest route from where you are, why don't you drive through Walworth County and try to spot the Beast of Bray Road?" I couldn't help but laugh at the idea. The Beast of Bray Road was a legend, a creature said to lurk in the rural areas of Walworth County, resembling a werewolf or some other half-man, half-wolf monstrosity. As far as I was concerned, it was the stuff of campfire tales and late-night horror movies, not something to be taken seriously. I initially dismissed the idea, planning to take the usual route to Madison. That Friday night, though, as I was leaving from work and traveling home to gather my things for the weekend trip, a sense of adventure came over me. I thought, what the hell, and decided to take my friend's advice, just for the thrill of it. As I drove north towards Walworth County, the sun went down and darkness was now upon me. I reached Walworth County and turned right onto Bray Road, a desolate stretch of asphalt that mostly drives into nothing. Open fields, a few isolated houses, and some eerie cornfields is about all that there is to the road. I switched on my high beams and scanned back and forth as I was driving the little 4-mile stretch of road. As I reached the end of it, I saw exactly what I expected to see. Absolutely nothing. Instead of taking the quickest route back, I decided to give it one more go, and I cut a U-turn. I had backtracked back down the road about a mile when I heard a pop, and my car started to wobble a little bit. Immediately I knew I had a flat tire. I drive an old car and haven't been the best at taking care of it, especially the tires. I got out and walked around, and sure enough, it was a flat. I opened my trunk and retrieved the spare tire, only to discover that it was nearly flat itself. I stood there frustrated, partly because of my situation, and partly because I hadn't prepared for something like this. A car or two passed as I stood there trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly, a pickup truck pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I explained my situation and mentioned my low spare tire. The man said that he lived nearby and offered to retrieve an air pump to help me out. I was grateful and agreed. As he drove off, I climbed back into my car, intent on passing the time by checking my phone. Lost in all of this was my location. I had completely forgotten where I was. I was still on Bray Road. Minutes dragged on as I played on my phone, and then, suddenly, bang. A huge bang brought me to attention, and I looked around. There was nothing. I got out and walked around to the other side of my car to find a huge rock lying next to my car. I looked up and into the cornfields nearby, and that's when I saw it. At first, all I saw was glowing eyes. It was dark, but those eyes were piercing straight through the cornfields. I froze. As the eyes moved forward a little bit, I could make out the silhouette of what looked like a large dog. Then, before I could even process what was happening, it stood up. The eyes rose up above the corn stalks, and I could make out a body on this thing. It stood upright, like a human, but its face resembled that of a dog. It had arms and hands. It didn't have paws. It had hands. Its eyes were red, and it was growling at me. I absolutely freaked out and scrambled back into my car and locked the doors. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, it was like something bumped up against my car. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to be circling the vehicle. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I looked in my rearview mirror, and this thing was on all fours coming around the backside of my car. It looked like it was massive. I began honking the horn, hoping the loud noise would scare it off, but it didn't. I was screaming and not knowing what to do. I was trapped. My car was propped up on a jack and had no wheel on it. I was paralyzed with panic. As it was about to reach my driver's side door, headlights appeared over the hill in the distance. I began honking my horn and flashing my lights frantically, hoping that someone would stop. The truck began to slow, and I could see that it was the man who had stopped earlier, returning with the pump. I looked into my rearview mirror and the dog, or whatever it was, had disappeared. I recounted the horrifying encounter, my voice shaking as I spoke. The man looked at me with a puzzled expression, yet I felt like he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Well, let's get you changed up and out of here," the man said. As I filled my spare with air and changed out tires, the man kept an eye on the cornfields. Fortunately, we didn't hear or see anything else out of the ordinary. When I finally reached Madison and told my friend what had happened, he chuckled and dismissed everything that I had to say, chalking it up to nothing more than an entertaining story. But I knew better. I was there. I saw the Beast of Bray Road. I know it's real, and I will never go back to that road ever again. Story 3. I live to tell about the Jersey Devil. The story I'm sharing with you happened to me a few years ago in the New Jersey Pinelands. Hunting season had just opened up, and I couldn't have been more excited about it. I've been a hunter all my life, and I was eager to get out and do the thing I loved. I headed out early so that I could get to my spot before the sun started coming up. I had been in this spot before and felt that it had good potential. I found a nice tree, settled up against it, and as normal hunts goes, I waited. A few hours passed as I watched and listened to the forest around me. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds and squirrels, and everything seemed normal. As the day wore on, I began to grow restless. I'd been in this spot for quite a while and hadn't seen or heard anything yet. I was just about ready to call it a day when I began to hear some motion behind me. It sounded like it was moving up towards me, so rather than turning around, I waited to see if it would come up and around into my field of view. Whatever it was sounded like it was on 4 legs. After all these years, the thrill of the hunt still excited me. I figured it was what I had come for, so I waited, my heart beginning to pound with anticipation. The steps were getting closer, and they seemed to be moving up from behind me and to my left. When I felt like it was close enough, and within my field of view, I slowly turned my head and strained to see through some underbrush and deadfall. At first, I could see some movement but couldn't make out any fine details. It was black in color, but that's about all that I could see. I wasn't sure yet what it was, but it definitely wasn't a deer. Maybe a black bear? Confusion started to settle in. Whatever it was down low. Then, it started making some noises. Sounds that I would describe as unnatural. They weren't loud, but they weren't like anything I've heard before. At least not in the woods. The best I could describe them as is the sounds that a baby would make. Kind of like a cackle and a grunt mixed together. Again, very difficult to describe, and very creepy. Then it rose up. Honestly, my first thought was to think to myself, wait, is that a horse? It was definitely black, and looked like it had a horse's head. So many thoughts went through my head in a fraction of a second. Is it a horse? What is a horse doing out here? Is that thing up on 2 legs? What in the hell am I looking at? The details of this thing began rushing in. It was still covered by some deadfall and brush, but I could now see from its lower chest up. The way it was positioned, it had to be standing on 2 legs. It was absolutely hideous. It looked like it had horns and it was sniffing at the air. It looked like it didn't have any hair, and its eyes were just as dark as its skin. I was absolutely frozen and terrified. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it hadn't yet seen me, and I was praying that it wouldn't. Luckily, I was downwind, and it was looking away from me. After a few sniffs, it dropped back down. It seemed to meander behind the brush for what felt like an eternity, and then it seemed to turn and walk back the way it came in. When I believed that it was turning back, I swear I saw a tail flick in the air. I don't know what else it could have been. I sat there, motionless, listening as it walked back deeper into the forest. After not hearing anything for a few moments, I gathered my things and hurried my way out of there as quickly as possible. When I got home, I told my wife. "Sounds like you saw the Jersey Devil," she said with a skeptical look. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I never saw wings, or the full body, or anything like that. But of the parts that I did see, it definitely matches up with other accounts of what others would call the Jersey Devil. I don't go into the woods as much as I used to, and if I were being honest with myself, I would say that the encounter has a lot to do with that. I don't know for certain what I saw that day, but I do know with certainty that there is something out there that shouldn't exist. Thanks for tuning into another episode from the Alley of Nightmares. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, subscribe, and share with all your friends. Until next time,